The complete history of the Nubians, kings of the Nile. How did a civilization living along the southern reaches of the Nile grow powerful enough to challenge the pharaohs of Egypt directly and eventually build more pyramids than Egypt itself ever did? How did a kingdom that ruled a vast stretch of northeast Africa for thousands of years and even placed its own black African kings on the throne of Egypt end up almost erased from the world's memory after the collapse of its final capital, Meroë? This is the entire story of the Nubians, the people of Kerma, Napata and Meroë, whose civilization rose, fell, rose again and left behind a legacy still being uncovered from beneath the sands of modern Sudan. Long before Egypt built its first pyramid, communities were already thriving along the stretch of the Nile River, running through what is today southern Egypt and northern Sudan, a region ancient Egyptians called Tarseti, the land of the bow, and modern archaeologists call Lower Nubia. Around 3500 BC, a distinct archaeological culture emerged here, known today simply as the A group, named by early 20th century excavators who lacked any surviving native name for these people. Life for the A group Nubians centered entirely on the rhythm of the Nile. Cattle herding formed the backbone of their economy, supplemented by fishing in the river itself and modest cultivation along the narrow strip of fertile land the annual floods made possible. Their pottery, decorated with intricate geometric patterns and often burnished to a fine polish, ranks among the most sophisticated ceramic traditions found anywhere in the ancient Nile Valley during this early period. In some respects more technically refined than contemporary Egyptian pottery of the same era. Trade connected Nubia to Egypt from an extraordinarily early date. Nubian merchants moved gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic animal skins northward, exchanging them for Egyptian manufactured goods, copper tools, and finished craft items that Nubian workshops did not yet produce themselves. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Kustal reveals Nubian burials from this period containing luxury goods, incense burners, and royal-style iconography, strikingly similar to symbols later associated with early Egyptian kingship, leading some scholars to argue that concepts of divine rulership may have developed in Nubia and Egypt in close parallel, rather than simply spreading south from Egypt, as older narratives once assumed. By around 3100 BC, as Egypt unified into its first dynasty under kings who now controlled the entire lower Nile Valley, Nubia's A-group culture faced increasing pressure from its newly powerful northern neighbor. Egyptian military campaigns and expanding trade monopolies gradually undermined A-group prosperity, and by roughly 2800 BC, this first distinct Nubian culture had faded from the archaeological record, not through sudden destruction, but through a slow squeeze on the resources and trade networks that had sustained it. Yet the relationship this period established, one of trade, rivalry, cultural exchange, and periodic domination between Egypt and Nubia, would define the next 3,000 years of history along this stretch of the Nile. Excavations at the Royal Cemetery of Kustal, conducted by American archaeologist Bruce Williams in the 1960s, produced some of the most debated evidence in the entire field of early Nile Valley archaeology. Among the finds was an incense burner decorated with a scene showing a crowned ruler seated on a boat, accompanied by imagery closely resembling later Egyptian royal symbols such as the falcon god Horus and the white crown of Upper Egypt. Williams argued this suggested that formal kingship, and perhaps even specific royal symbols later associated exclusively with Egyptian pharaohs, may have first developed among the Nubian rulers of Kustal before or alongside their emergence in Egypt itself, a claim that generated considerable controversy among Egyptologists reluctant to see any of Egypt's foundational royal symbolism as having Nubian origins. While the debate remains unresolved, most specialists today accept that early Nubian and early Egyptian societies developed their concepts of sacred kingship through close, ongoing contact rather than in isolation from one another, undermining older assumptions that Nubia simply borrowed a fully formed royal ideology from a more advanced Egyptian civilization to its north. Seasonal migration patterns also shaped A-group society in ways archaeologists continue to reconstruct through careful study of settlement patterns along the riverbank. Communities appear to have moved between permanent riverside settlements during the annual flood season and more dispersed grazing camps further from the river during drier months, a flexible subsistence strategy well suited to the unpredictable rhythms of Nile flooding in this southern stretch of the valley, where the river's behavior differed noticeably from its more predictable behavior further north in Egypt proper. This adaptability, developed over many centuries of careful observation and adjustment, would remain a defining feature of Nubian society long after the A-group culture itself had faded, echoed in the resilience later Nubian kingdoms would repeatedly demonstrate whenever facing external conquest, environmental hardship, or shifting regional trade patterns throughout the following 3 millennia of recorded history along this same stretch of river. After several centuries of reduced archaeological visibility following the decline of the A-group, a new and far more powerful Nubian civilization emerged further south, centered on the city of Kerma, near the third cataract of the Nile in what is now central Sudan. By around 2500 BC, Kerma had grown into the first genuinely urban, centralized political power in Nubian history, controlling trade and resources across a wide stretch of the middle Nile Valley. The most visible surviving monuments from Kerma are its massive mud brick structures known as defufas, towering religious buildings whose exact original function remains debated among archaeologists, though most agree they served as temples or elite ceremonial platforms central to Kerma's state religion. The largest of these structures, the western defufa, still stands today at a height of roughly 18 meters, an extraordinary feat of mud brick engineering that required organized labor, centralized planning, and sustained political authority to construct and maintain over generations. Kerma's wealth flowed primarily from its control over gold-producing regions further south and east, along with its position as the essential middleman in trade routes carrying gold, ivory, ebony, incense, and exotic animals northward toward Egypt. This economic strength translated directly into military power, and by the era Egyptians called the Middle Kingdom, roughly 2000 to 1700 BC, Kerma had become a serious rival to Egyptian ambitions in the region, rather than a simple trading partner content to remain in Egypt's shadow. Nubian archers from this period earned a reputation across the ancient Near East that would follow their descendants for centuries. Egyptian texts and artwork consistently depict Nubian bowmen as elite, highly skilled troops, and Egypt itself eventually hired large numbers of Nubian mercenary archers into its own armies, a practice significant enough that Egyptians sometimes referred to the entire region using terms that essentially meant land of the bow. Egyptian pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom, wary of Kerma's growing strength, constructed an extensive chain of massive fortresses along the Nile in Lower Nubia, including the fortress complex at Buhen, designed specifically to contain Kerma's expanding influence and protect Egyptian access to Nubian gold and trade goods flowing north. Kerma's royal cemetery, located just outside the city, contained enormous burial mounds called tumuli, some more than 90 meters in diameter, covering underground burial chambers that in the largest examples held the remains of hundreds of retainers, apparently sacrificed to accompany their ruler into the afterlife, a practice that speaks to the immense concentration of political and religious authority Kerma's kings had achieved by the height of the city's power. Excavations conducted by Swiss archaeologist Charles Bonnet over several decades revealed that Kerma's urban centre included large audience halls, granaries, and specialised workshop districts for metalworking and faience production, evidence of a genuinely complex urban economy rather than a simple chiefdom. Egyptian records from this period occasionally describe Kerma using the term Kush, a name that would later be revived by Nubian rulers themselves centuries afterward, and Egyptian sources make clear that Kerma's rulers were regarded not as a minor frontier nuisance, but as a legitimate rival kingdom capable of threatening Egyptian territory directly, particularly during periods when Egypt's own central authority weakened, such as during the politically fragmented era Egyptians later called the Second Intermediate Period. During this same period of Egyptian weakness, Kerma appears to have formed a direct alliance with the Hyksos, a foreign dynasty that had seized control of northern Egypt, coordinating pressure against the native Egyptian rulers still clinging to power in the south around Thebes. A letter discovered at Thebes, sent from the Hyksos king to Kerma's ruler and intercepted by Egyptian forces before delivery, reveals this alliance was substantial enough to genuinely alarm Egyptian leadership, since it raised the very real prospect of Egypt being squeezed simultaneously from the north by the Hyksos and from the south by Kerma. This diplomatic and military coordination between Kerma and the Hyksos represents one of the earliest documented examples of a sophisticated Nubian kingdom operating as an equal partner in complex international relations spanning the wider northeastern African and Near Eastern political landscape, rather than functioning merely as a passive object of Egyptian imperial ambition. It was ultimately this very alliance that helped trigger Kerma's downfall. Egyptian rulers of the emerging new kingdom, having finally expelled the Hyksos from northern Egypt, turned their attention southward with particular determination, precisely because Kerma had so recently allied itself with their defeated northern enemies, treating the destruction of Kerma's independent power not merely as economic opportunity, but as a matter of settling old scores against a kingdom that had once threatened Egypt from two directions simultaneously. The balance of power that had allowed Kerma to flourish as a genuine rival to Egypt collapsed dramatically during Egypt's New Kingdom period. Beginning around 1500 BC, a series of powerful Egyptian pharaohs, including Thutmose I and Thutmose III, launched sustained military campaigns deep into Nubian territory, eventually destroying Kerma as an independent political center and bringing the entire region under direct Egyptian administrative control for the first time in its history. Egyptian rule over conquered Nubia took a distinctly different form from earlier periods of trade and rivalry. Egyptian pharaohs constructed grand stone temples throughout Nubian territory, many dedicated to Egyptian gods such as Amun, effectively exporting Egyptian state religion into the heart of what had been an independent Nubian cultural sphere. The temple complex at Soleb, built under Amenhotep III, and later the colossal rock-cut temples at Abu Simbel, constructed under Ramesses II, stand as some of the most impressive examples of this deliberate Egyptian religious and architectural presence imposed on conquered Nubian soil. Economically, Egyptian administrators organized the systematic extraction of Nubian gold on a scale far beyond anything achieved during the earlier Kerma period, funneling enormous quantities of precious metal northward to fund Egyptian temple building, royal luxury, and international diplomacy. Since gold from Nubia gave Egyptian pharaohs a crucial diplomatic advantage when negotiating with other Bronze Age powers such as Babylon and the Hittite Empire, both of which frequently requested Egyptian gold in royal correspondence that has survived to the present day. Nubian society under Egyptian rule experienced substantial cultural transformation as well. Young Nubian men were regularly conscripted into Egyptian military service, while Nubian elites who cooperated with Egyptian administration often adopted Egyptian titles, dress, burial customs, and religious practices, producing a genuinely blended Egyptian-Nubian elite culture visible clearly in the archaeological record of this period. At the same time, older Nubian traditions never disappeared entirely. persisting quietly within local communities even as Egyptian administrators, priests, and garrison troops controlled the region's political and religious institutions for nearly 4 centuries, until Egyptian New Kingdom power itself began to weaken from around 1100 BC onward. The Egyptian administrative system imposed on conquered Nubia centered on an official known as the Viceroy of Kush, a senior royal appointee who governed the entire Nubian territory on the pharaoh's behalf and answered directly to the Egyptian crown, overseeing gold production quotas, temple construction projects, and local Nubian chieftains who were permitted to retain limited authority so long as they cooperated fully with Egyptian demands. Egyptian sources record specific annual gold quotas extracted from Nubian mining districts, figures large enough that some modern economic historians consider Nubian gold the single most important source of precious metal funding Egypt's New Kingdom imperial ambitions across the wider Near East. Temple inscriptions from this period, including records left by Pharaoh Amenhotep III, also boast of enormous captured herds of cattle and thousands of enslaved Nubian captives brought north following punitive military campaigns. A stark reminder that alongside cultural blending and cooperation, Egyptian rule over Nubia during this period also rested firmly on coercion, forced labor, and the extraction of human as well as material resources from the conquered population. Despite the harshness of conquest and occupation, some Nubian individuals achieved genuine prominence within Egyptian society itself during this period, most notably Herpri, a Nubian-born noble who served as a close royal companion during the reign of Thutmose IV and was granted the extraordinary honor of burial in the Valley of the Kings, the same royal necropolis reserved for pharaohs and their closest family members, a privilege almost never extended to anyone born outside Egypt's own royal lineage. His finely painted coffin and burial goods, discovered largely intact in the early 20th century, offer a striking counterpoint to the broader pattern of conquest and extraction, demonstrating that individual Nubians who rose through Egyptian court or military service could occasionally achieve remarkable social status, even as the wider Nubian population under occupation continued to bear the heavy costs of Egyptian imperial rule. As Egypt's New Kingdom collapsed into political fragmentation and reduced international influence after 1070 BC, Egyptian administrative and military control over Nubia weakened correspondingly, eventually withdrawing from the region almost entirely. Rather than reverting to political fragmentation, however, Nubian communities used this opportunity to reconstruct an independent, centralized state, drawing directly on the memory of Kerma's earlier greatness, while also absorbing centuries of Egyptian administrative and religious practice they had witnessed firsthand under occupation. This new kingdom, which historians call Kush, established its capital near Napata, close to the fourth cataract of the Nile, deliberately situating itself near Jebel Barkal, a dramatic flat-topped sandstone mountain that Egyptian occupiers themselves had identified centuries earlier as a sacred dwelling place of the god Amun. Nubian rulers of this revived kingdom embraced this same sacred geography, reviving and expanding religious traditions centered on Jebel Barkal in ways that positioned their new kingdom as a legitimate continuation rather than a rejection of the religious authority Egyptian pharaohs had once claimed over the region. Over the following decades, Kushite kings steadily consolidated authority over a wide territory stretching along the Nile, rebuilding administrative structures, restoring temple institutions, and gradually accumulating the military strength that had been deliberately suppressed during centuries of Egyptian occupation. Royal burial practices from this period, including early pyramid-style tombs constructed near Napata, reveal a deliberate revival of ancient symbols of legitimate kingship, blending older Kerma period traditions with clearly Egyptian-derived royal iconography, absorbed during the long occupation period. By around 750 BC, Kush had grown into a powerful, well-organized kingdom, controlling significant military and economic resources, watching with close attention as Egypt itself, just to the north, fractured into competing regional power centers ruled by rival local dynasties, with no single pharaoh capable of asserting authority over the entire country. For Kushite kings, this Egyptian political weakness represented an unmistakable historical opportunity, one that a Kushite ruler named Piye would soon seize with dramatic and lasting consequences for the entire ancient Near East. The period separating Egypt's withdrawal from Nubia and the emergence of the fully documented Napatan kingdom around 750 BC remains one of the least understood eras in the entire Nile Valley's ancient history. Sometimes called Nubia's Dark Age by modern archaeologists, due to the relative scarcity of surviving written records from these centuries. What limited evidence does survive, primarily from royal burials at El Kuru near Napata, shows a clear and deliberate continuity in royal burial customs stretching back toward Kerma period traditions, even as these same burials also display unmistakable Egyptian religious symbolism absorbed during the centuries of prior occupation. This blending suggests that the rulers who eventually founded the Napatan kingdom saw themselves not as a wholly new political project, but as the rightful heirs of both Nubia's older independent royal tradition from the Kerma era and the Egyptian religious framework of divine kingship that occupying pharaohs had imposed upon their ancestors, a dual inheritance that would define Kushite royal ideology for centuries to come. Royal succession in this reconstituted Kushite kingdom followed a distinctive pattern that would persist for centuries afterward, in which kingship passed not simply from father to son, but according to a system that gave considerable weight to selection among eligible male relatives of the royal family, sometimes guided by oracle pronouncements attributed to the god Amun himself, delivered through his priesthood at the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal. This oracle-based succession system, whatever its precise mechanics actually involved in practice, gave Kushite kingship a distinctly religious character from its very foundation, reinforcing the close partnership between royal and priestly authority that would remain a defining feature of Nubian kingship throughout the following centuries of Napatan and later Meroitic rule. Around 750 BC, the Kushite king Piye began a series of military campaigns northward into fractured Egypt, initially framed as a response to appeals from Egyptian priests and local rulers seeking protection from rival warlords destabilizing the country. Piye's campaign proved remarkably successful, and by around 728 BC, his forces had defeated a coalition of competing Egyptian rulers and brought the entire Nile Valley, from deep within Nubia all the way to the Mediterranean coast, under unified Kushite control for the first time in history. Piye's own inscriptions, preserved on a large stone monument known as the Victory Stela, reveal a ruler who saw himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the legitimate restorer of proper Egyptian religious and royal order, a genuinely devout worshipper of the Egyptian god Amun, who insisted his defeated Egyptian rivals purify themselves before being allowed into his presence, reflecting Piye's own deep religious conviction rather than simple political theatre. Piye's successors, ruling as Egypt's 25th dynasty, governed a unified Egyptian and Nubian kingdom for nearly a century, and among their most notable achievements was a genuine architectural and religious revival across Egypt itself. Kushite pharaohs sponsored temple restoration projects throughout Egypt, revived archaic artistic styles drawn from Egypt's much older Old Kingdom period, and constructed new pyramid tombs at Napata and the nearby royal cemetery of El Kuru, reviving pyramid construction as a royal burial practice at a time when Egypt's native rulers had largely abandoned it centuries earlier. This golden age faced its greatest challenge from the expanding Assyrian Empire, whose armies pushed into Egypt during the reigns of Kushite pharaohs Taharqa and Tantamani. Assyrian forces under kings Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal launched devastating invasions of Egypt during the 670s and 660s BC, eventually sacking the ancient capital of Thebes in 663 BC, an event so shocking that it was still remembered centuries later, even referenced in the Hebrew Bible as a warning of divine judgment. Kushite pharaohs fought hard to defend their Egyptian territories against superior Assyrian iron weaponry and siege technology, but by 656 BC, sustained military pressure finally forced Kushite rulers to withdraw permanently from Egypt, retreating south to continue ruling their original Nubian homeland as an independent kingdom no longer extending into the Nile Delta. Taharqa, arguably the most powerful of the 25th dynasty pharaohs, ruled Egypt and Nubia together for over a quarter century and left behind an extraordinary architectural record, including additions to the Great Temple at Karnak and a massive kiosk structure whose surviving column still ranks among the tallest single architectural elements to survive from the entire ancient Egyptian world. Taharqa is also mentioned directly in the Hebrew Bible, in the second book of Kings, where he appears as an ally of the Judean king Hezekiah against Assyrian forces besieging Jerusalem, one of relatively few points where Nubian history intersects directly and explicitly with biblical narrative. The eventual Assyrian conquest of Thebes under Ashurbanipal in 663 BC and the eventual retreat of Taharqa's successor Tantamani back to Nubia a few years later marked the definitive end of Kushite rule over Egypt, though the 25th dynasty's cultural and religious revival left a lasting imprint on Egyptian art and architecture that persisted for generations after Kushite political control itself had ended. The pyramids these Kushite pharaohs constructed at El Kuru and later at Nuri, near Napata, differ noticeably from both their much older Egyptian predecessors and their later Meroitic successors. Typically built with a steeper angle than Old Kingdom Egyptian pyramids, but generally smaller in overall scale, reflecting available resources and labor rather than any lesser degree of royal ambition. Taharqa's own pyramid at Nuri, the largest constructed by any Kushite ruler, still stands as physical testimony to a dynasty that, even after losing direct control over Egypt itself, continued for centuries afterward to draw confidently on the same royal architectural traditions its ancestors had once imposed as conquered subjects and later revived as conquering pharaohs in their own right. A remarkable full-circle transformation achieved across less than 2 centuries of recorded history. Following the loss of Egypt, Kushite kings continued ruling from their traditional base near Napata for roughly another 2 centuries, but growing pressure from new regional powers to the north, along with a gradual southward shift in the kingdom's economic and demographic center of gravity, eventually convinced Kushite rulers to relocate their primary royal capital further south to the city of Meroë, situated between the 5th and 6th cataracts of the Nile, a transition largely completed by around 300 BC. Meroë's location offered clear strategic and economic advantages over Napata. It sat closer to lucrative trade routes connecting the African interior to the Red Sea coast, and crucially, it sat within a region rich in iron ore deposits and abundant timber for fuel, resources that would transform Meroë into one of the ancient world's most significant centers of iron production. Enormous slag heaps still visible around Meroë today, remnants of centuries of continuous iron smelting, led the pioneering British archaeologist Arthur Weigall to describe ancient Meroë as the Birmingham of Africa, referencing the industrial iron-producing city in England, a comparison that has stuck in popular historical writing ever since. This iron industry fundamentally reshaped Meroitic society and military capability. Iron tools improved agricultural productivity across the kingdom, while iron weapons gave Meroitic armies a significant technological advantage over neighboring peoples still relying primarily on bronze or stone implements. Meroë's iron production likely ranks among the earliest large-scale iron industries anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa, and some archaeologists argue that ironworking knowledge and technology may have spread from Meroë into other regions of Africa over subsequent centuries, though the exact roots of this technological diffusion remain an active area of ongoing research. Culturally, the shift to Meroë also marked a gradual but unmistakable move away from strict dependence on Egyptian artistic and religious models. While Egyptian gods such as Ammon continued to receive worship, Meroitic art increasingly incorporated distinctly African stylistic elements, local deities absent from the traditional Egyptian pantheon, and decorative motifs found nowhere in Egyptian art, reflecting a kingdom that, having lost direct political control over Egypt, was now confidently developing its own independent cultural identity, rather than continuing to define itself primarily in relation to its former northern territory. The scale of Meroë's iron industry becomes especially clear from the sheer volume of surviving archaeological waste material. Modern surveys of the slag heaps surrounding the ancient city have estimated that Meroitic furnaces produced iron continuously across many centuries, using a furnace design that archaeologists have identified as distinctly Meroitic in engineering, rather than a simple copy of furnace technology imported from Egypt or elsewhere. Some researchers have proposed that Meroitic ironworking techniques, and possibly ironworking knowledge itself, may have spread gradually westward and southward into other parts of sub-Saharan Africa through trans-African trade contacts, though direct archaeological proof of this diffusion route remains difficult to establish conclusively, given the wide geographic distances and centuries involved. What is clear is that by the height of its iron-producing centuries, Meroë commanded a level of metallurgical output that few, if any, other African societies of the same era could match. The transition of the royal capital from Napata to Meroë did not happen all at once, and evidence suggests that Napata retained enormous religious significance as the ceremonial and spiritual heart of the kingdom for centuries, even after Meroë had become the primary seat of everyday royal government and administration. Kings continued to be crowned at Napata and, in many cases, still chose to be buried in the older royal cemeteries near their ancestral religious centre, rather than at Meroë itself, reflecting an enduring reverence for Jebel Barkal's sacred status that no shift in practical political geography could fully displace. This dual capital arrangement, with religious authority remaining anchored at Napata, even as economic and administrative power increasingly concentrated at Meroë, illustrates the kingdom's characteristic willingness to preserve older sacred traditions, even while adapting practically to new economic realities, driven by Meroë's superior access to iron ore, fertile agricultural land, and expanding trade routes toward the Red Sea. Sometime around the 2nd century BC, Meroitic scribes developed an entirely new writing system, moving away from Egyptian hieroglyphs, which had previously served as the primary script used in royal Nubian inscriptions, toward a script specifically designed to represent the sounds of the Meroitic language itself. This new script existed in two related forms: a hieroglyphic version reserved mainly for formal religious and royal monuments, and a cursive version used more broadly for everyday administrative writing, a division of function similar to the relationship between formal hieroglyphs and simplified hieratic script in Egyptian writing tradition. The Meroitic script represents a genuinely significant achievement in the history of writing, since unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs, which required mastering hundreds of complex signs, Meroitic used a relatively compact alphabet of only around 23 symbols, functioning much like an alphabet or syllabary rather than the far more complex logographic and phonetic hybrid system found in Egyptian hieroglyphic writing. This made the Meroitic script, at least in principle, considerably easier to learn and use than the Egyptian writing system it replaced. Despite more than a century of dedicated scholarly effort, beginning with the pioneering work of British Egyptologist Francis Llewellyn Griffith in the early 20th century, the Meroitic script remains only partially understood today. Scholars can read the script phonetically, meaning they can sound out the words it represents with reasonable confidence, but the underlying Meroitic language itself remains poorly understood, since it is not closely related to Egyptian, ancient Nubian languages spoken later in the region, or any other well-documented ancient language, leaving many surviving inscriptions readable but not fully translatable into modern languages. This linguistic mystery has left significant gaps in modern understanding of Meroitic civilization, since the vast majority of decipherable inscriptions consist of relatively formulaic royal titles, offering formulas and religious dedications, rather than the extended narrative texts, royal annals, or personal letters that have proven so valuable for reconstructing detailed political and social history from ancient Egyptian sources. Modern researchers, including a growing number of Sudanese scholars working with renewed international attention and improved computational linguistic tools, continue working toward a fuller decipherment, holding out hope that Meroë's own voice, preserved in stone for 2,000 years, might eventually speak more fully to modern historians. Griffith's original breakthrough came from analysing bilingual funerary texts alongside carefully repeated formulaic phrases that appeared consistently across many different inscriptions, allowing him to assign phonetic values to individual Meroitic signs even without a full understanding of the underlying language's grammar or vocabulary. More recent scholars, including French linguist Claude Rilly, have proposed that Meroitic may belong to the Northern East Sudanic language family, a group that includes some modern languages still spoken in parts of Sudan and South Sudan today, a hypothesis that, if further confirmed, would provide crucial new comparative material for finally unlocking the deeper structure and vocabulary of the ancient Meroitic language. Until that work advances further, however, thousands of surviving Meroitic inscriptions carved into temple walls, funerary stelae, and offering tables across the ruins of ancient Meroë remain tantalizingly visible, yet only partially understood. A reminder that even well-preserved written evidence cannot guarantee that a civilization's own words will be fully heard by later generations. The adoption of a distinct Meroitic script, alongside continued use of Egyptian hieroglyphs for certain formal purposes, suggests a deliberate cultural choice by Meroitic elites rather than simple necessity, since by this period, Meroitic scribes had already used Egyptian hieroglyphic writing competently for many centuries and could easily have continued doing so exclusively. Instead, the creation of a script tailored specifically to the sounds of their own spoken language suggests a Meroitic ruling class increasingly confident in projecting a cultural identity distinct from Egypt, expressed through the very medium of writing itself. One of the clearest possible symbols of political and cultural independence a literate ancient society could produce, alongside its own coinage, distinct royal regalia, and locally developed artistic and religious traditions that together marked Meroë as a civilization no longer content to define itself purely through Egyptian cultural categories. One of the most historically significant features of Meroitic civilization was the remarkable political authority exercised by royal women, who ruled at various points not merely as supporting figures beside male kings, but as fully independent monarchs, commanding armies, negotiating with foreign powers, and constructing their own royal pyramid tombs on equal terms with male rulers. Ancient Greek and Roman writers used the term Candace, likely derived from a Meroitic word meaning queen mother or royal woman, to refer to these powerful female rulers, and the term became so strongly associated with Meroitic queenship that later writers sometimes mistakenly treated it as a personal name rather than a royal title. Meroitic royal succession appears to have followed a system in which the Queen Mother held enormous institutional authority, sometimes ruling as a fully independent sovereign in her own right rather than merely as regent for an underage son, a pattern quite distinct from succession customs in most contemporary Mediterranean and Near Eastern kingdoms, where female rulers generally held power only temporarily, pending the maturity of a male heir. Several Meroitic pyramid tombs, built to the same scale and with the same royal iconography as tombs constructed for male kings, belonged to queens who reigned independently, demonstrating unambiguously that Meroitic society recognized female sovereignty as a fully legitimate form of royal rule. Meroitic artwork frequently depicts these ruling queens with notably substantial physical stature, shown personally leading troops into battle, receiving foreign delegations, and performing religious rituals traditionally reserved for kings in neighboring civilizations. Visual evidence strongly suggesting that female rule was not merely tolerated as an occasional necessity, but actively celebrated as an expected and admired feature of Meroitic political life. The most famous of these ruling queens, Amanirenas, would soon demonstrate this authority in the most dramatic way possible, personally leading Meroitic forces against the might of Rome itself, a confrontation that would produce one of the most remarkable diplomatic outcomes of the entire ancient world, and cement the legacy of powerful Nubian queens in historical memory for millennia to come. The prominence of Meroitic royal women extended well beyond Amanirenas alone. Inscriptions and monuments identify numerous other ruling or co-ruling queens across Meroe's long history, including Shanakdakete, who appears to have reigned as a fully independent monarch as early as the 2nd century BC, making her possibly the earliest known female ruler in the entire ancient Nile Valley to hold power in her own name rather than as a regent or consort. Temple reliefs from this period also show queens participating directly in what were normally exclusively royal religious ceremonies, including the ritual smiting of captured enemies traditionally depicted with the king alone in Egyptian art. A striking visual statement that Meroitic queens were not simply honored figures, but full participants in the ideological performance of royal military power. This consistent, long-term pattern of female authority sets Meroitic civilization apart from most of its ancient contemporaries and represents one of the most historically significant and distinctive features of Nubian political culture. Some historians have proposed that this tradition of powerful royal women may trace its roots back even further, to the matrilineal inheritance patterns suggested by certain burial customs at Kerma many centuries earlier, though the evidence from this much older period remains far more fragmentary than the rich Meroitic material documenting later royal queens in considerable detail. Regardless of its precise origins, the institution of powerful Meroitic queenship stood in sharp contrast to the far more limited formal political roles available to royal women in contemporary Ptolemaic Egypt, classical Greece, or Republican and early imperial Rome, making Meroe one of relatively few ancient civilizations anywhere in the Mediterranean or Near Eastern world where sustained, independent female political and military leadership was not merely tolerated as an occasional exception, but woven into the fundamental structure of royal succession and governance itself across many generations. Following Rome's annexation of Egypt in 30 BC, after the defeat of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, the new Roman province shared a direct border with the Kingdom of Meroë for the first time in history, and tensions between the two powers escalated quickly. Around 25 BC, Meroitic forces, under the command of the ruling queen Amanirenas, launched a significant military campaign into Roman-controlled southern Egypt, attacking Roman garrison towns, including the city of Syene, modern Aswan, and reportedly capturing statues of the Roman Emperor Augustus as trophies of war, a deliberate and highly symbolic act of political defiance against the world's most powerful empire. The Roman prefect of Egypt, Gaius Petronius, responded with a substantial military counteroffensive, advancing deep into Meroitic territory and capturing several important Nubian towns, including the ancient religious center of Napata itself, which Roman forces reportedly sacked and partially destroyed around 22 BC. Despite this significant setback, Meroitic forces under Queen Amanirenas continued resisting Roman advances rather than accepting outright conquest, fighting a sustained campaign against Roman garrisons left behind to hold the captured territory. What followed proved remarkable by ancient standards. Rather than continuing an expensive and logistically difficult war deep in Nubian territory, far from easily resupplied Roman bases, both sides eventually agreed to direct negotiations. Queen Amanirenas, according to the Greek geographer Strabo, personally sent an ambassador to negotiate terms directly with Emperor Augustus, who was residing on the island of Samos at the time these negotiations concluded, around 21 or 20 BC. The resulting peace treaty proved remarkably favourable to Meroë, establishing a border between Roman Egypt and the Meroitic kingdom, cancelling tribute payments that Rome had previously demanded from Nubian territory, and effectively recognising Meroë as an independent power dealing with Rome as something approaching an equal, rather than as a conquered client state. An outcome few other peoples who directly challenged Roman military power during this era of aggressive imperial expansion ever managed to achieve. This successful defense of Meroitic independence stands as one of ancient Nubia's most significant historical achievements, and the story of Amanirenas standing firm against Rome remains one of the most celebrated episodes in the entire history of ancient African resistance to foreign imperial power. Roman writers themselves left behind physical evidence of this conflict in an unexpected place. Excavations at Meroë uncovered a bronze head from a statue of Emperor Augustus, deliberately buried beneath the entrance steps of a Meroitic temple, positioned so that anyone entering the building would symbolically walk over the Roman emperor's severed image for as long as the building remained in use. A striking piece of physical propaganda confirming ancient accounts that Meroitic forces had indeed captured Roman imperial statuary during their campaign and put it to deliberately humiliating symbolic use. The bronze head, now held in the British Museum, remains one of the most vivid surviving artifacts connecting Meroitic military history directly to the wider Roman world. A tangible reminder that this successful African resistance to Roman imperial ambition was real, physically documented, and clearly a source of considerable pride for the Meroitic kingdom that achieved it. The Roman historian and geographer Strabo, who recorded much of what modern scholars know about this conflict, describes Queen Amanirenas using a Greek term suggesting she had lost an eye, possibly in battle, a detail that later generations of writers sometimes embellished into legend, but which, if accurate, would suggest a ruler who took a genuinely direct and physically dangerous personal role in leading her forces against Rome rather than directing the campaign safely from a distant palace. Following the successful conclusion of these negotiations, the border between Roman Egypt and Meroë stabilized for the remainder of Roman imperial history, and no further major military conflict between the two powers is recorded. a peace that held for centuries and stands as one of the most durable frontier settlements Rome ever negotiated with a power it had not fully conquered. This outcome carried real strategic value for Rome as well, since maintaining a stable, peaceful southern border in Egypt, the empire's most important grain-producing province, mattered far more to Roman interests than the difficult and costly prospect of attempting a full conquest of Nubian territory deep into unfamiliar desert terrain, a calculation that likely weighed as heavily in Augustus's willingness to negotiate generous terms as any purely military consideration arising from the fighting itself. Meroë's long-term prosperity rested fundamentally on its position as an essential commercial link between the interior of sub-Saharan Africa and the wider trading networks of the Mediterranean and Red Sea worlds. Gold remained Meroë's most valuable export throughout its history, mined from sources scattered across the eastern desert regions of Nubia and processed at royal workshops before flowing north through Egypt or east toward Red Sea ports for shipment abroad. Beyond gold, Meroitic merchants dealt extensively in ivory, harvested from African elephants, ebony and other valuable hardwoods, ostrich feathers and eggs, exotic animal skins including leopard and cheetah hides, and live animals such as elephants, which Meroitic traders supplied to Hellenistic and later Roman customers, eager for African wildlife for both military use in war elephants and public entertainment in arena spectacles. Incense and aromatic resins, sourced from further south and east, also passed through Meroitic hands on their way toward Mediterranean markets that prized these substances for religious and medicinal use. The Nile River itself functioned as Meroë's primary transportation artery, though the presence of several dangerous cataracts, stretches of rocky rapids that interrupted smooth river navigation, meant that goods frequently had to be transferred to overland caravan routes for portions of their journey north toward Egypt. Additional trade routes ran overland eastward from Meroë toward the Red Sea coast, connecting the kingdom to maritime trade networks that ultimately stretched as far as Arabia, India, and beyond, part of the broader ancient trading system linking the Mediterranean world to South and East Asia. Archaeological excavations at Meroë have uncovered imported goods from remarkably distant origins, including Mediterranean wine amphorae, fine Roman and Hellenistic glassware, and Indian Ocean trade goods, providing physical confirmation of just how thoroughly integrated Meroë had become into ancient long-distance trade networks. Meroë's relationships with Arabian trading states along the opposite Red Sea coast also grew increasingly significant during the kingdom's later centuries, as Arabian merchants and eventually the rising power of Aksum in the Horn of Africa began competing more directly for control over these same lucrative trade routes that had once flowed almost exclusively through Meroitic hands. The port city of Adulis, on the African side of the Red Sea, served as one of the most important gateways connecting Meroitic trade goods to maritime networks reaching toward Arabia and beyond, and the growing prosperity of this coastal trade corridor over time gave rise to the very Aksumite kingdom that would eventually challenge Meroë's regional dominance. Ancient sources also describe the movement of exotic animals along these trade networks, including the transport of live elephants northward for use in Hellenistic and later Roman military campaigns, since war elephants had become highly prized battlefield assets following Alexander the Great's campaigns in India. And African elephants, sourced through Nubian and Red Sea trade networks, became an important, if logistically challenging, commodity feeding this specific military demand across the wider Mediterranean and Near Eastern world for several centuries. Gold mining itself in the eastern Nubian desert relied on organized labor drawing on techniques passed down over many generations, with workers following visible quartz veins containing gold deposits, crushing the extracted rock by hand, and washing the resulting material to separate gold from waste rock. a labor-intensive process that ancient Greek and Roman visitors to the region occasionally described with evident fascination at the scale of organized effort involved. Surviving administrative records, though limited by the ongoing challenges of fully reading Meroitic script, suggest a centralized system for managing gold production and distribution, with royal officials overseeing mining districts and ensuring that a substantial portion of extracted wealth flowed toward the crown, funding not only luxury goods and temple construction, but also the military forces and diplomatic gifts that helped Meroë maintain its independence and regional influence across so many centuries of contact with larger and often more militarily powerful neighboring civilizations. Despite Meroë's political and military significance, much of what defined daily life within the kingdom centered on more ordinary concerns: agriculture along the Nile floodplain, herding cattle and goats across the surrounding savanna, and the steady rhythms of craft production in iron, pottery, and textiles that sustained both royal courts and ordinary households across the kingdom's territory. Religious life at Meroë blended older Egyptian-derived worship of gods such as Amun, still honored in grand temple complexes throughout the kingdom, with distinctly local Nubian deities absent from the traditional Egyptian pantheon, most notably the lion-headed war god Apedimак, who appears prominently in Meroitic temple reliefs and royal inscriptions as a powerful protector deity closely associated with Meroitic kingship and military success, reflecting the kingdom's growing confidence in its own independent religious identity. Meroë's most visually striking legacy remains its pyramids, of which more than 200 survive today across several royal cemeteries near the city, considerably more in raw number than the pyramids built in Egypt itself, though Meroitic pyramids are generally much smaller and steeper in profile than their famous Egyptian counterparts. Constructed from sandstone blocks with characteristically steep angles, often around 60 to 70 degrees compared to Egypt's much shallower pyramid slopes, these Meroitic royal tombs typically included an attached chapel structure decorated with relief carvings depicting the deceased ruler in the presence of Egyptian and Nubian gods alike. Images that today provide historians with some of their richest surviving visual evidence for reconstructing Meroitic royal ideology and religious practice. Iron tools transformed daily agricultural and construction work throughout Meroitic society, allowing more efficient clearing of land, improved irrigation infrastructure along the Nile, and more durable construction techniques for both royal monuments and ordinary domestic buildings. Archaeological evidence from residential areas within Meroë itself reveals a genuinely prosperous urban population, living in well-built mud brick and occasionally stone houses, supplied with goods from across the kingdom's extensive trade networks, painting a picture of a civilization whose ordinary citizens, not merely its royal elite, benefited substantially from centuries of accumulated wealth, technological innovation, and relatively stable governance. The so-called royal baths at Meroë, a large water installation decorated with elaborate relief carvings and likely fed by a sophisticated hydraulic system drawing water from the Nile, illustrate the level of engineering sophistication and comfortable urban living the kingdom's elite enjoyed at its height. Nearby, the Sun Temple, described by ancient visitors and partially confirmed through excavation, apparently served both religious and possibly astronomical functions, further evidence of a capital city investing heavily in monumental architecture that expressed both religious devotion and considerable engineering ambition. Everyday material culture recovered from Meroitic sites, including finely made pottery, jewelry combining gold with semi-precious stones, and imported luxury goods from as far away as the Mediterranean and India, confirms that Meroë's prosperity was broadly shared enough to support a substantial urban middle class of craftsmen, merchants, and administrators, alongside the royal court itself. Meroitic pottery in particular stands out as one of the kingdom's most distinctive and technically accomplished artistic achievements, produced on a fast wheel and often decorated with fine painted designs depicting animals, plants, and geometric patterns, rendered with a delicacy that some modern ceramic specialists rank among the finest pottery traditions anywhere in the ancient world. Workshops producing this pottery, along with specialized centers for ironworking, faience production, and jewelry manufacture, appear to have operated both within Meroë itself and in smaller provincial towns scattered throughout the kingdom's territory, suggesting a well-developed economic network capable of supplying both royal and popular demand for finely crafted goods across a geographically extensive and administratively sophisticated ancient African state. By the early centuries of the first millennium AD, a powerful new state was rising to Meroë's southeast, in the highlands of what is today Ethiopia and Eritrea. The kingdom of Aksum grew rapidly during this period, building its own wealth through control of Red Sea trade routes and expanding steadily westward and northward, placing it on an increasingly direct collision course with Meroitic interests in the same regional trade networks that had long sustained Nubian prosperity. Competition between the two kingdoms intensified over control of valuable trade corridors linking the African interior to Red Sea ports, routes that Meroë had dominated for centuries, but which Aksum, with its more direct access to the Red Sea coast itself, was increasingly well positioned to divert toward its own expanding commercial networks instead. This economic rivalry unfolded alongside Meroë's own gradual internal decline, as centuries of intensive iron production had begun placing serious strain on the kingdom's surrounding environment. Matters came to a head during the reign of the Aksumite king Ezana, who ruled during the 4th century AD and left behind inscriptions describing a military campaign against the Nubian region, referred to in Aksumite sources by a name historians generally associate with the declining Meroitic kingdom or its immediate successor communities. Ezana's inscriptions describe defeating hostile forces and destroying settlements along the Nile, campaigns that most historians interpret as targeting a Meroitic state already significantly weakened by internal economic and environmental problems, rather than a still thriving major power at the height of its historical strength. Whether Aksumite military action delivered a final decisive blow to Meroë or simply accelerated a decline already well underway from other causes remains genuinely debated among historians, since archaeological evidence suggests Meroë's core problems, drought, resource depletion, and administrative fragmentation, were already deeply entrenched well before Ezana's campaigns occurred. What is clear is that Aksum's rise permanently altered the balance of regional power in northeast Africa, and the Kingdom of Aksum itself would go on to become one of the most significant African powers of late antiquity, eventually adopting Christianity as its official state religion during Ezana's own reign, several centuries before Christianity would eventually spread into the former territories of Meroë itself. Aksum's own inscriptions, written in multiple scripts including Ge'ez, Greek, and Sabaean, provide a rare outside perspective on Meroë's final decades, describing a region already suffering from internal disorder and weakened central authority by the time Aksumite forces campaigned there. Some historians have suggested that Ezana's campaign may have been directed less at the formal Meroitic royal government itself, which some evidence suggests had already largely collapsed, and more at the Nubia peoples who had begun settling and asserting control over former Meroitic territory in the power vacuum left by the kingdom's decline, meaning Aksum's role in Meroë's story may be less that of a conquering destroyer and more that of an opportunistic regional power stepping into a political vacuum that internal Nubian crises had already created over the preceding decades. The rivalry between Meroë and Aksum also reflected a broader shift in the economic geography of Northeast African trade during late antiquity, as maritime routes across the Red Sea and Indian Ocean grew increasingly important relative to the older overland and river-based trade networks that had sustained Meroë's prosperity for centuries. Aksum's direct access to Red Sea ports gave it a structural advantage in capturing this growing maritime commerce, while Meroë, despite its own eastern trade connections, remained more fundamentally oriented around the Nile River and the overland caravan routes that had defined Nubian trade since the days of Kerma. A geographic orientation that served the kingdom well for thousands of years, but left it comparatively less able to adapt as the center of gravity in regional trade gradually shifted toward the sea during the early centuries of the first millennium AD. By the beginning of the 4th century AD, the Kingdom of Meroë faced a convergence of crises, severe enough to overwhelm even a state that had successfully weathered military conflict with both Assyria and Rome centuries earlier. Climate evidence gathered by modern researchers points to a significant period of reduced Nile flooding and increasing aridity across the region during these final centuries, undermining the agricultural productivity that had sustained Meroitic population centers for generations. Centuries of continuous, large-scale iron production had also taken a severe environmental toll on the landscape surrounding Meroë. Iron smelting required enormous quantities of charcoal fuel, and the resulting deforestation across the region surrounding the capital likely contributed to soil erosion, reduced local rainfall patterns, and a broader ecological degradation that made the immediate area around Meroë progressively less capable of supporting the population density the kingdom had achieved at its historical peak. Compounding these internal environmental and economic pressures, Meroë also faced growing military pressure from nomadic peoples along its frontiers, particularly a group Roman and later Aksumite sources refer to as the Nubia, whose increasing raids and eventual settlement within traditionally Meroitic territory further destabilized an already weakened kingdom, struggling to maintain effective centralized control over its remaining lands. The cumulative effect of environmental decline, economic disruption to long-distance trade networks increasingly diverted through Aksum, external military pressure, and probable internal political fragmentation proved fatal to centralized Meroitic royal authority. Sometime around 350 AD, generally understood to coincide roughly with the period of Izaina's Aksumite campaigns, organized royal government at Meroë effectively ceased to function, and the once great capital, home to Nubian royal dynasties for over 6 centuries, was gradually abandoned. Its temples, palaces, and royal pyramid cemeteries left to the slow encroachment of desert sand, not to be systematically studied again until European and eventually Sudanese archaeologists began serious excavation work many centuries later. Unlike some ancient capitals that vanished in a single catastrophic destruction event, Meroë's decline appears from the archaeological record to have been gradual, marked by a slow reduction in monumental construction, decreasing quality and quantity of luxury imports found in later burials, and the eventual cessation of new royal pyramid construction altogether, all consistent with a kingdom experiencing prolonged economic and administrative decay rather than a single decisive military defeat. The very last Meroitic royal inscriptions, difficult to date precisely given the ongoing challenges of fully reading the Meroitic script, suggest a kingdom whose rulers continued attempting to maintain traditional religious and royal functions, even as the practical reach of their authority steadily contracted, a poignant final chapter for a state that had once controlled trade and territory across an enormous stretch of Northeast Africa. Modern paleoclimatic studies, drawing on sediment cores and other environmental evidence gathered from along the Nile Valley, have helped confirm that the broader region experienced a genuine long-term drying trend during the final centuries of Meroitic history, part of a wider pattern of climatic change affecting large portions of northeast Africa during late antiquity. This environmental context helps explain why a kingdom that had successfully weathered military conflict with Assyria, defended itself against Roman legions, and maintained centuries of prosperous trade, ultimately proved unable to survive the combined pressures of reduced agricultural productivity, resource depletion from its own iron industry, and shifting trade patterns, illustrating how even historically resilient and militarily capable civilizations can ultimately prove vulnerable to slow-moving environmental and economic pressures that no army, however skilled, can simply defeat on a battlefield. The political collapse of centralized Meroitic authority did not mean the disappearance of Nubian civilization itself, but rather its transformation into several smaller successor kingdoms that emerged along the Nile Valley during the centuries following Meroë's decline. Historians identify three principal successor states: Nubia in the north, Mercuria in the central Nile region, and Alodia further south, each inheriting portions of Meroitic territory, population, and cultural tradition, even as centralized royal authority on the scale Meroë had once commanded never fully returned to the region. During the 6th century AD, these successor Nubian kingdoms underwent another profound transformation, converting to Christianity through missionary efforts connected to the Byzantine Empire, a shift that fundamentally reshaped Nubian religious life, artistic production, and written culture for the following several centuries, as Christian Nubian kingdoms adopted Greek and later Old Nubian as primary languages of religious and administrative writing, effectively displacing the Meroitic script and language that had defined the kingdom's earlier golden age. Despite these dramatic religious and political transformations, elements of older Nubian cultural tradition persisted through subsequent centuries, surviving in various forms within the folk customs, material culture, and oral traditions of communities living in the Nile Valley region that would eventually become part of modern Sudan, even as the specific memory of Meroitic royal history itself faded from popular consciousness across the wider world for well over 1,000 years. The rediscovery and serious scholarly study of Meroitic civilization only began in earnest during the 19th and 20th centuries, initially led largely by European archaeologists and Egyptologists, who often approached Nubian history primarily through its relationship to ancient Egypt, sometimes underestimating the independent achievements of Nubian civilization in its own right. In more recent decades, a growing generation of Sudanese archaeologists and historians has taken increasingly prominent leadership roles in Nubian archaeological research, working to ensure that Meroë's history is studied and presented as a significant African civilization in its own right, rather than merely as a secondary chapter within the broader story of ancient Egypt. The three successor kingdoms that emerged following Meroë's decline each developed distinct political trajectories over subsequent centuries. Mercuria, centered on the city of Old Dongola, eventually absorbed neighboring Nubia and grew into the most powerful and longest-lasting of the three Christian Nubian states, successfully resisting several early Arab military expeditions following the 7th century Islamic conquest of Egypt and negotiating a remarkable long-term treaty known as the Pact, which regulated peaceful trade and diplomatic relations between Christian Nubia and Muslim Egypt for over 600 years, one of the longest-lasting diplomatic agreements in pre-modern history. Alodia, the southernmost of the three kingdoms, centered near modern Khartoum, maintained its own independent Christian tradition until its eventual decline in the early 16th century. marking the final political end of a Christian Nubian tradition that had, in its own way, carried forward elements of Meroitic royal and religious culture for over 1,000 years after the fall of Meroë itself. Christian Nubian art and architecture from this successor period reveal a fascinating blend of Byzantine Christian religious influence with older, locally rooted artistic sensibilities that can be traced back through Meroitic tradition, visible especially in the vividly painted murals decorating churches at sites such as Faras, a Nubian cathedral whose remarkably well-preserved wall paintings, rescued through an international archaeological effort before the site was flooded by the construction of the Aswan High Dam in the 1960s, now form one of the most important collections of Christian Nubian art anywhere in the world, currently housed primarily in museums in Warsaw and Khartoum. These paintings, depicting Nubian bishops, kings and biblical scenes rendered with distinctive local artistic conventions, offer some of the clearest surviving evidence that even after the specific religious and political framework of ancient Meroë had disappeared, a recognizably continuous Nubian artistic and cultural tradition persisted along the Nile for many centuries afterward, adapting to new religious circumstances while still carrying forward a distinctive regional identity shaped by thousands of years of prior history. Looking back across more than 3,000 years of Nubian history, from the earliest riverside communities of the A-group culture through the rise and fall of Kerma, the conquest and later reconquest of Egypt itself, the industrial iron economy of Meroë, and the kingdom's eventual gradual decline, a clear pattern emerges. This was a civilization defined by remarkable resilience, repeatedly rebuilding itself after periods of conquest, occupation, or environmental crisis, rather than a people who simply lived in Egypt's permanent shadow, as older historical narratives sometimes suggested. The story of Nubian civilization offers a valuable corrective to historical narratives that have too often treated ancient Egypt as an isolated, uniquely exceptional achievement disconnected from its wider African context. Nubian pyramid building, Nubian kings ruling as legitimate pharaohs of Egypt itself during the 25th dynasty, and Nubian queens successfully defending their kingdom's independence against the full military might of Rome, all demonstrate conclusively that sophisticated, powerful, and independently innovative African civilizations flourished along the Nile for millennia, developing their own writing systems, their own religious traditions, and their own remarkable engineering and industrial achievements, including some of the earliest large-scale iron production anywhere on the African continent. Modern archaeological research continues to add new depth to this understanding. Ongoing excavations conducted by Sudanese archaeological teams, often working in close partnership with international researchers, continue to uncover new inscriptions, tombs, and settlement sites across the Nile Valley, gradually filling gaps in the historical record left by centuries of relative scholarly neglect, compared to the intense attention traditionally devoted to ancient Egypt just to the north. The physical legacy of this civilization also remains remarkably visible today. The pyramids of Meroë, though smaller than their more famous Egyptian counterparts, survive today in far greater number, standing largely intact across the Sudanese desert as a direct, tangible connection to a civilization that once controlled trade routes stretching from the African interior to the Mediterranean and Arabian worlds. For modern Sudan, and for the broader field of African history, the Nubian civilization centered on Kerma, Napata, and Meroë stands as powerful evidence of ancient African political sophistication, religious innovation, and technological achievement. A civilization that ruled the Middle Nile Valley for well over 3,000 years, and whose story, once nearly forgotten by the wider world, continues to be recovered, piece by piece, from beneath the sands that eventually claimed its greatest cities. The Pyramids of Meroë were formally recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2011, a designation that has helped draw renewed international attention and conservation funding toward a site that, despite its historical significance, had for many decades received only a fraction of the visitors and scholarly resources devoted to the Pyramids of Giza, just a few hundred miles to the north. Modern satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in recent years continue to reveal previously unknown structures buried beneath the sands surrounding Meroë, suggesting that significant portions of this ancient capital remain entirely unexcavated even today. For a civilization that once commanded the loyalty of pharaohs, the fear of Roman legions, and control over trade routes stretching from Central Africa to India, the story of the Nubians stands finally not as a forgotten footnote to Egyptian history, but as one of the great, independent civilizations of the ancient world, patiently waiting, after 17 centuries of silence, for the rest of the world to finally listen. There is also a deeper human lesson embedded within this long and layered history, one that extends well beyond the specific details of Nubian kings, queens, pyramids, and trade routes. Across more than 3,000 years, the peoples of Kerma, Napata, and Meroë demonstrated a consistent capacity to absorb pressure from more powerful neighbors, whether Egyptian, Assyrian, or Roman, without losing their own underlying identity, repeatedly finding new ways to rebuild political authority, economic prosperity, and cultural confidence, even after periods of conquest, occupation, or environmental hardship that might have permanently erased a less resilient society. That pattern of resilience, adaptation, and eventual renewal offers a genuinely universal historical lesson, one relevant far beyond the specific geography of the Middle Nile Valley, about the remarkable capacity of human societies to endure, adapt, and ultimately reassert themselves across even the longest and most difficult stretches of historical time.